Hello, my name is Nathan Hill, and this is my presentation for my Fire and Safety for Industry and Business class, my semester presentation, and it is on hazardous waste operations in the United States, something we also know today to be HAZWOPER, which stands for Hazardous Waste Operations and Emergency Response. Today, during my presentation, I hope to break down three objectives for you that is very clear for a business or plant to be OSHA compliant. The first objective is to understand the history and evolution of hazardous waste operations. And the second objective is to understand the importance of training for HAZWOPER. And when we get to the end of those two, we should obviously understand what it takes to be OSHA compliant under HAZWOPER. For the purpose of this presentation, I'd like to give some definitions that we understand to be throughout the entire presentation as well as the paper presented to you today. First, for one to be hazardous waste operation and emergency response regulations, you must be under one of the five main groups of employers and their employees. These five groups are listed here. They are cleanup operations that are conducted at uncontrolled hazardous waste sites, any corrective actions involving cleanup operations at sites under the RCRA, which we will talk about later in today's presentation, any voluntary cleanup operations at uncontrolled hazardous waste sites. The fourth one is operations involving hazardous waste that are conducted at treatment, storage, and disposal facilities pursuant to the RCRA and the EPA, which again we will talk about later. And then the last one is any emergency response operations for releases of or substantial threats of release of hazardous substance, regardless of the location of the hazard. So today we'll be talking about hazardous waste and hazardous substance. So I figured we should also define those. Hazardous substances are any substances defined under section 101.14 of CERCLA or CERCLA, which we will again mention later in today's presentation. Any biological agent and any other disease-causing agent, which after being released into the environment will cause a number of things such as death, disease, abnormalities, cancer, mutations, psychological malfunctions, and there are some more that are listed right there in section B of this. Also, the hazardous substance will be defined as any substance listed by the Department of Transportation, and then a hazardous substance also includes hazardous waste, which will be defined on the next slide. Hazardous waste will be defined as a waste or combination of waste as defined in the Code of Federal Regulations listed there, as well as those substances defined as hazardous waste in that Code of Federal Regulations. Now, the CFRs are mentioned more in the paper. Simply what those CFRs state is it just gives you a list of other areas to check to see what hazardous materials, and by the time you click through all of the regulations, whether it be CFR or OSHA or EPA, you finally get to a list of things that are included as hazardous waste. So with those definitions, we will jump right into the first objective, which is to understand the history and evolution of HAZWOPER in the United States. Now, HAZWOPER has gone through 6 main history and evolution points within the United States, starting in 1940 and going to 1990. So you can see that 50-year period in which we were constantly changing and evolving what hazardous waste operations had to be. It started in 1940 with the Hanford site, which is in Washington, and then it ended in 1990 with the creation of HAZWOPER as we know it to be today. So let's delve deeper into each of these 6 events within United States history. The first one happened in 1940 and is known as the Hanford site. This is a site in the state of Washington in which it was one of the main locations for nuclear weapons developments within the United States of America. Actually, one of the nuclear bombs that were dropped in Japan was created here in this site in Washington. With the amount of production that was coming out of the Hanford site, it was clear that something on a federal or state level had to be done in order to deal with the amount of nuclear waste that was being produced on a daily level. Even today in 2016, according to a EPA posted website, the Hanford site is currently the most contaminated nuclear site in the United States. So you can see the top left-hand corner is the size of the Hanford site. You can see that nothing is really around it. However, the waste could get dumped into the water that is to the right and contaminate local residents within Washington state. Then the bottom left-hand picture is a sign that is currently posted outside the Hanford site in Washington. They're at each of the entrances that leads to the site. So in response to the Hanford site, the United States Congress decided that they needed to pass a law. And that led us to 1976, where they passed the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, also known as the RCRA. Now, this is known as the cradle to grave management system, as it took waste from its initial inception to its disposal and so-called death of hazardous waste. It created the management of waste from the point of creation to the point of disposal, and that it stated that the waste generator, so the company or person who generated the waste, is ultimately responsible for the generation, transportation, and in the end, the disposal of hazardous waste. It created the framework for the correct management of hazardous waste, which again includes generation, transportation, and disposal. Um, so it was the first law that was passed that regulated the management of hazardous materials within the United States. And when this law was passed, many people thought that the American government finally had a handle on hazardous waste operations and that they did something effective in order to do so. We saw later in 1970 with the incidents of the Love Canal and the Valley of the Drums. Now, if you look to the left, you will see a picture of the Love Canal. Behind that fence is a body of water, a canal, called the Love Canal, which is in the state of New York. Now, what was happening there is that hazardous management companies were dumping their waste into the river that was then getting into local residents in that area of New York's water supply, causing them illness, sickness, death, as well as their offsprings were given birth defects. So that was seen in the state of New York. But then also around the same time in the state of Kentucky, they were seeing the Valley of the Drums, and that is the picture on the right that depicts hazardous waste companies just dumping drums and drums of hazardous waste in the middle of nowhere. However, they were still around residents, and that caused hundreds of thousands of birth defects and deaths and illnesses combined in the state of Kentucky. So the federal government felt that something had to be done in response to these two incidents. So they created the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, or CERCLA, which is also referred to as Superfund, and it imposed a tax on petroleum and chemical industries. And then, as you can see through this map, it created federal oversight to respond directly to the release of to respond directly to the release or threatened release of hazardous materials that would either harm the public health and the environment or threaten the harm of public health or the environment. So through CERCLA, they started with the discovery of contamination to site closeout. Then 6 years later, many people felt that people involved in the operation of hazardous materials should have a minimum amount of training. So the United States Congress passed the Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act, also known as SARA. Now you can see what Sarah said through the graph that is behind the text. It just created stronger guidelines for government oversight of cleanup sites, as there were currently no consequences being enforced for people who were dumping waste and not cleaning it up. So you can see the local emergency planning committee's responsibilities through that 1986 law. 4 years later, we had HAZWOPER created. And this was a conjunction between the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the United States Coast Guard, the EPA, and the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. Because hazardous waste was so dangerous, HAZWOPER protects everyone against dangers for themselves, the workplace, as well as the environment. HAZWOPER was created and it was so strong that it is what we continue to use today, even in 2016. Now, in order to be HAZWOPER compliant, you have to be able to be trained through HAZWOPER. Now, this leads us to the importance of training, and the importance of training is clear on the surface level to protect individuals with hazmat from death or injury. Now, many times it's hard to tell if you are in the presence of such materials, but with the proper training, you are able to detect if you are in the presence and then prevent yourself and the people you are working with from having lifelong health effects that could eventually lead to a early death. Now, anyone who works with hazardous materials, is required to complete a 24-hour HAZWOPER course. Now, if they are higher up in ranks, it might even be a 40-hour or a 48-hour course. And the nice thing about HAZWOPER is that every year you must take an 8-hour refresher through HAZWOPER. So training is essential with hazardous waste operation compliance, not only to protect yourself, but to protect others in the workplace and the environment. Being OSHA compliant. Now, OSHA compliance for HAZWOPER is hundreds of thousands of pages long and probably hundreds of websites wide. But the OSHA website breaks it down into three main areas of compliance. That is emergency response, cleanup, as well as training. First, emergency response. Now, OSHA compliance just through words is very difficult to understand. So they provided these flowcharts for me to use in the presentation to figure out the best way to be OSHA compliant. Now, first we'll deal with emergency response, which is in the blue, and then lead to post-operation cleanup compliance, which is in the orange. Now, these regulations are laid out in OSHA regulations 1910 and 1926. And according to paragraph A3 of OSHA regulations, the emergency response specifically applies to response activities where there is an uncontrolled release of a hazardous substance or where an uncontrolled release is likely. These situations include high concentrations of toxic substances, immediately dangerous to life and health environments, anything that presents an oxygen deficiency, a fire hazard, an evacuation, immediate attention because of the danger posed. Now, this is figure 1 in my paper, so if you flip to figure 1 in the paper, you can look at it much more closely, and this determines whether it is an emergency response or not, and if you need to be HAZWOPER compliant. With cleanup, it all is contingent upon who is doing the cleanup. So you will see if it is a third party, you must comply with paragraphs B through O, but if it is one of your own employees, you just have to meet the CFR requirements listed under the flowchart on that bottom side. Another area of compliance is training. So again, it is dependent upon what the hazard is and the tasks that are being performed by certain workers. So you can see that depending on what you will be doing depends on the amount of training that is required to be OSHA compliant. So you can go through and read that for a couple seconds. Again, this is figure 2 in my paper. So if you cannot read it right now, you can flip to figure 2 and look at it more closely. And last but not least, more training. So this flowchart is if your response is not HAZWOPER but still requires hazardous materials. So you can go through this flowchart. It also tells you what training is required for managers and supervisors as well as workers, and kind of how to be OSHA compliant within a hazardous materials incident. So today, we looked at the history and evolution of HAZWOPER that has led us to being compliant where we are today. We looked at the importance of training to protect the lives and environments of those around the plant and or business. And then we looked at compliance for emergency response cleanup and training that can be met through the following flowcharts that were presented before you. At the end of the day, hazardous materials are one of the dangerous threats to human life that we have in 2016. So we have to make sure that businesses are being OSHA compliant because as the EPA stated on the front page of their website for hazardous materials and hazardous waste and emergency operations is that if these materials are able to kill a tree, just think what they can do to the human body. Thank you.